Rick thinks it's a good thing that Geese wasn't supposed to face Angelica next year, otherwise, she would have wiped the floor with him. Rick throws a fist bump toward Angelica, and she smiles, returning it. He's then announced as the victor, and the crowd goes wild. Geese is carried off on a stretcher, and Angelica thanks Rick for winning the match. Rick brushes it off, saying there's no need for thanks, he just won his match. Angelica promises she'll one day reach the same level of strength Rick showed in his single year, and Rick looks forward to seeing it. The crowd cheers for him. Meanwhile, Snape is watching calmly, and he mentions he's surprised by how things turned out, though part of him is glad Geese lost. He explains that Geese's talent ended his career as a fighter, and although Geese lost a lot today, Snape feels pretty good. Alyssa finds it all a bit complicated, but Mazette shrugs and says, "This is how adults are." Snape goes on to say that he's sad he won't be able to take Angelica as his wife. Angelica, however, reminds him that their contract is off now since he can't come up with the money. Snape leaves, saying he would have loved to have had a lady like her as his wife, which makes Angelica's heart skip a beat. Later, we see Kelvin getting ready to head into the arena. His master asks how he's feeling, and Kelvin says he's doing great. His master reminds him that he's the strongest fighter and tells him to go all out. Kelvin finds his master's behavior a little strange but decides to honor his wish. The match between Kelvin and Braun starts, and the crowd cheers for Kelvin. Just by looking at Braun, Kelvin can tell he's incredibly strong. He attacks with a punch, followed by a barrage, but it doesn't even faze Braun. Braun counters, but Kelvin dodges. Kelvin thinks to himself that Braun is the strongest opponent he's faced so far. Suddenly, Geese breaks into the arena, attacking the audience in a berserk rage. Snape wonders if Geese's dragon blood has caused him to lose control. The audience tries to flee as Geese goes on a rampage, but Kelvin calls out angrily, telling Geese to stop disturbing his match. Geese tries to attack him, but Kelvin stops him with a single punch, knocking Geese out cold. Rick and the others are surprised to see this, and Rick points out that Geese should be as strong as an A-rank adventurer. Rionette suggests that this means Kelvin has reached S-rank level. The announcer then announces that the match will be postponed until tomorrow due to the interruption. Kelvin is unhappy about this delay, and Braun comments that he can see doubt in Kelvin's punches, which surprises him. At lunch, Braun is frustrated that the match was postponed, but Mazette tells him not to worry. They'll win anyway, especially since they've got the Grand Orb. Angelica wonders where Rick is, and Rionette tells her he's gone jogging to Clarissa, which astonishes Angelica. It's a 700 kilometers round trip, but Angelica tries not to act surprised. Meanwhile, Rick is near the country's border when he spots a small mountain that reminds him of Rionette. He sees smoke around the mountain and goes to check it out, only to find Kelvin training by himself. Kelvin's annoyed that Rick's interrupting his solitude, but Rick hopes he's not overworking himself, especially with a match tomorrow. Kelvin admits he's just a bit restless because of the delay and asks Rick to spar. Rick blocks Kelvin's attacks and throws a punch, but Kelvin dodges it. Rick is surprised at how fast Kelvin can dodge and counter. He asks if Kelvin had a stuffy nose during the match, but Kelvin denies it. He starts to open up, telling Rick that he was born in the slums and fighting was the only fun thing for him. When he first arrived in Heritopia, he won his first tournament without a problem, and the second tournament was the same. But as he kept winning, all the fights ended in a single blow, and he stopped enjoying them. Kelvin's only joy came from training to get stronger. One day, he overheard his master talking to a tournament staff member about how the tournaments were losing popularity because all the fights were too easy. His master was told that if things didn't change, both Kelvin and the tournament would face consequences. To keep the audience entertained, Kelvin started intentionally losing some fights. In his next few tournaments, he learned how to make the fights exciting again. He went on to win 3 tournaments in a row, but this is why he can't use his full power during a match. Rick listens and thinks that being strong really is tough. Kelvin mentions that Rick has no idea what he's talking about, but Rick insists that he won't be holding back in tomorrow's match. Kelvin wonders if Rick really understood what he just said, but Rick quickly takes his leave. The next day, the match between Braun and Kelvin begins again, with a barrier set up around the arena for safety. Kelvin charges in with a barrage of punches, but Braun doesn't even flinch. Kelvin then uses a move called R-Fong, which makes his punch more powerful by using rotation. Rick is impressed, and Angelica explains the technique. Kelvin keeps attacking, but Braun counters and dodges easily. Kelvin admits to himself that Braun is a monster, but Braun comments that Kelvin is holding back. Kelvin wonders if Braun heard this from Rick. It turns out Rick told Braun everything. The audience is curious about what they're talking about. Kelvin then says that if he shows his true power now, everyone will realize he's been faking it. He calls Braun a professional for putting on a good show for the audience, but Braun says it's a shame that Kelvin has to hold back. To make things fair, Braun decides to fight using only 2 fingers and tells Kelvin to do his best. Kelvin accepts the challenge. Kelvin attacks with a flurry of punches, but Braun blocks with just 2 fingers. Even Kelvin's R-Fong is blocked with ease. Braun then throws Kelvin to the ground but holds back. Kelvin realizes that Braun is stronger than he expected, but he still refrains from going all out. Kelvin's master shouts from the stands, telling him that he's misunderstanding the situation. He reminds Kelvin that his goal is to train the strongest fighter in the world, his dream is to make Kelvin the best. Hearing this, Kelvin decides to stop holding back. He's finally ready to fight at full strength, and he's thrilled by the chance to do so. Kelvin punches Braun with everything he's got, but Braun easily blocks it with all 5 fingers. The crowd is starting to realize that Kelvin is much stronger than he appeared before. Kelvin's been deceiving them all, and they're not happy about it. Kelvin, however, knows there's no turning back now, so he decides to give it everything he's got. He casts a 5th nature fire spell, surprising everyone since beastmen are usually bad at nature magic. Rick realizes how hard Kelvin must have trained to be able to do this. Even Kelvin's master is amazed by his power. But Braun counters with a spell of his own, using earth magic to block Kelvin's fire attack. Kelvin isn't giving up though. He uses blink step and stalwart charge to attack, but Braun traps him using 7th nature vine magic asterisk. The audience begins to realize how strong Braun really is, and they start to worry that this fight is about to get out of hand. Braun frees himself from the vines and decides to go all out, too. He heads toward Kelvin with terrifying speed, and Kelvin feels a surge of fear he's never experienced before. The wind pressure from Braun's punch knocks Kelvin back, and Angelica can't believe what she's seeing. Rick, however, seems completely unfazed, knowing full well how this match will end. Braun heads toward Kelvin again, and this time Kelvin goes all out with his strongest magic. But even with all his spells, Braun doesn't even flinch. Rick notices that Kelvin's mana is running low after all the spells he's cast. In the final moments, Braun lands a punch that knocks Kelvin back. Angelica thinks it was a direct hit, but Rick points out that Kelvin used his defensive magic to minimize the damage. Kelvin's body is battered, but he refuses to give up. He's been waiting for a fight like this his whole life. The crowd starts cheering him on, even though they know he's been holding back. Kelvin gets back up, determined to land one last punch. His body lights on fire as he channels all his strength into his final attack. Rick explains that Kelvin is using Blink Step enhanced with Stalwart Fist and Flame Sword asterisk. But even with all his power, Kelvin's punch barely moves Braun. Braun, impressed by Kelvin's resolve, decides to end the match with one final blow. A punch straight to Kelvin's face. Kelvin's master watches from the stands and reflects that the road to becoming the strongest is still long, but Kelvin is already the best fighter in history. Braun is announced as the winner of the match, and both Rick and Angelica congratulate him. Angelica comments on how he completely dominated the champion, but Braun mentions that the champion's final strike was impressive. Rick adds that they're almost holding the grand orb in their hands now. He tells Braun that he plans to withdraw from the next match but also says he's looking forward to facing him again someday before leaving. Angelica notices how stressed Rick is, to the point that his hair has started falling out. Meanwhile, Kelvin is in the hospital reading the newspaper, which reports that while his semifinal match was exciting, it wasn't cool that he hid his true strength from his fans. It's causing a lot of backlash, and the number of critics has grown. He asks his master if he's okay with all of this, but his master reassures him, saying it will be fine. He's curious about Kelvin's last move against Braun, surprised that Kelvin had something like that in him. Kelvin admits he doesn't even remember what happened at the end because he was so caught up in the fight. His master encourages him to master that move and wonders why Kelvin is still so down about everything. Kelvin asks why his master continues to support him, especially after he lost and deceived the audience. His master responds that he knows Kelvin was just looking out for them in his own way, and even though he lost, he'll get stronger and win next time. Kelvin's master says he's like a son to him, which makes Kelvin pause. Just then, Braun bursts into the room to check on Kelvin's injuries. Kelvin admits that he's hurting all over, but when Braun offers to heal him, Kelvin turns it down. He says it's been a while since he's felt pain like this, and he wants to appreciate it. Braun understands, and Kelvin reflects on how Rick was right about him. He remembers Rick saying it would be fine to go all out against Braun and that he's looking forward to the final match. We then cut to Snape visiting Rick at his inn. When he finds out that Rick has locked himself in his room, Angelica tries to get him to open up. She tells him to stop being childish, but Rick insists that fighting in the final match will only kill him, no matter what. Snape arrives to encourage Rick, but he's shocked by Rick's attitude. He tells Rick that everyone is really excited about the final match this year, especially since Kelvin lost in the semifinals. He asks Rick to fight for the fans, but Rick says he values his life more than the tournament. Snape sings a song about the millions of coins being bet on the match and the thousands who've worked hard to make the tournament possible. He says if Rick refuses, it will all be for nothing. Snape leaves, saying everyone will have to abandon their dreams if Rick backs out, and that makes Rick start to rethink. Angelica then tells Rick that Snape's right, and he should participate, even if it means dying. Snape can just revive him. Rick tells her she can say that because she's never died herself, and dying is still scary, even with the promise of revival. Angelica knows Rick has trauma but points out that he survived 2 years of brutal training with Braun, so a brief match should be nothing compared to that. Rick insists that training and fighting are completely different things, and she'll never understand. This surprises Angelica, and she says she used to look up to him as a mentor, but now she's disappointed. She leaves, upset. Mizet then asks Rick if he's ever wondered how Braun had such a detailed training plan for him right from the start. Rick finds it odd and thinks that maybe Braun prepared the plan in advance, hoping to train someone who could help defeat Kaiser Alpia. Mizet confirms that's part of the reason, but he adds that Braun also had a personal goal, to train someone who could brawl with him on equal footing. He explains that orcs have a habit of fighting each other, and Braun has always been alone, never able to brawl with anyone who could match him. Mizet believes that now, with Rick, Braun might be able to finally fulfill that dream. Mizet says Rick is free to withdraw if he wants, but he should also think about Braun's feelings. He then takes his leave, with Elisar following him. Mizet suggests that Rick should enjoy the fight, as Braun has been looking forward to it for a long time. As Rick remembers his first day at the Orichalcum Fist castle, he recalls meeting Braun, who could tell right away that Rick was unskilled and had the lowest mana capacity. Rick was surprised that Braun could figure that out just from a handshake, and Braun told him that he could sense his mana flow and muscle development. Braun told Rick he didn't have any natural talent as an adventurer, but that he'd have to train hundreds of times harder than those who did. He warned Rick to be prepared for that. Back in the present, Angelica is still frustrated with Rick for acting so immature. Mizet understands how Rick feels but points out that Braun's training was hell on earth, and it's surprising that Rick's mind didn't break after all that. Angelica starts to realize just how tough Rick's journey must have been, especially since he started adventuring in his 40s without any skills. Alyssa steps in to correct her, saying that Rick actually has an inherent skill. Angelica is shocked, having never seen him use it. Mizet explains that the skill's activation is complicated, and its power is hard to control. It also takes a toll on Rick's body, which is why Braun banned him from using it at night. Later, Rick asks Rionette if she thinks he's lame. She assures him that she doesn't and says that no matter what he chooses to do, he'll always be the same to her. However, she would love him even more if he fought Braun without fear, just for the sake of his dream. The scene then shifts to the tournament's final match, where the announcer declares that the champion will be decided today. Snape is on edge, worried he'll go bankrupt if Rick forfeits. The announcer reveals that the winner will get a cash prize of 300 million loose coins, the championship belt, 100 kilograms of magic crystals, golden slime bags, and a pair of hot springs tickets. The crowd is getting really hyped. Angelica asks Rick if he's feeling alright, and he says he's refreshed, ready to face everything head-on. Angelica is glad to hear that, but she can tell Rick is just pretending to be tough. As the match begins, Rionette whispers something in Rick's ear, and that seems to fire him up. The contestants enter the arena, and Angelica is happy to see Rick looking so energized. Rick tells Braun that he'll fight with everything he has, and Braun is excited, saying he's been looking forward to this fight. Kelvin, watching from the sidelines, wonders how the fight will play out since both are unpredictably strong. The announcer starts the match, and Rick charges at Braun using his blink step, so fast that the audience can't even follow. They exchange a flurry of blows, and Braun's arm ends up injured. Snape wonders what kind of magic Rick is using, but Mizet and Alyssa explain that it's not magic at all, it's enhanced hand-to-hand combat. Rionette adds that it's a series of blows topped off by Rick's thread slicer. Rick uses blink step again and lands a volley of punches, but Braun blocks them all. He tries to hit Rick back, but Rick dodges and uses thread slicer again. Angelica struggles to keep up with their moves but remembers how Rick trained her to understand combat. As they continue to fight, Angelica notices that Rick seems more motivated than ever. She wonders what Rionette whispered to him, and Rionette reveals that she promised to take him to the hot springs if he wins. Rick is pumped about the reward, and Angelica is flustered when she realizes what that means: they'll be spending the night together. Rionette confirms it, making Angelica even more embarrassed, but she decides to focus on the match. Rick is starting to tire from his continuous attacks, and Braun, noticing this, feels it would be rude to only play defense. He tries to hit Rick with a shockwave punch, but Rick dodges, causing tremors in the arena. Kelvin notes that the punch was as strong as 5th-tier nature magic. Rick starts to doubt himself, fearing that charging in blindly will get him killed. As Braun launches a series of shockwaves, Rick dodges all but one. He then uses 1st-tier nature magic, Air Cushion, to block another hit. Kelvin's master is impressed, noting that not even he can use incantation-less magic. Rick says it's all thanks to Mizet and Elissar. Mizet reflects on how worried he was when Rick took a direct hit from Elissar's magic, which vaporized half of Rick's body. Angelica looks on, concerned for Rick, but he charges at Braun again, using blink step to create a smoke screen. Braun catches him and lands a blow, but Rick blocks and dodges into the air. Braun attacks him again, but Rick uses air cushion on his feet to stay afloat and dodge. Rick then launches an air shot while suspended in midair, but Braun blocks it. Angelica watches in awe, thinking the fight defies logic. This is what a battle between S-rank monsters must be like. Rick realizes that his air shot won't work from a medium distance, so he prepares to use it at close range. Braun acknowledges Rick's growth and admits that his training plan was perfect, but it all came down to Rick's willpower. Rick is honored by Braun's words but says they're more fitting for a master to say to a disciple. He tells Braun that it's not good enough, and that he now understands the true purpose of his training plan. He knows Braun's dream and is determined to give him the fight he's always wanted. Braun is taken aback, and though he tries to downplay it, Rick is certain that Braun's passion was real. He's ready to repay that debt with the best fight he can give. Braun starts by telling his story, going back 46 years. When he was 5, he noticed he was different from the others in his pack. He looked different, and he thought differently too. He started collecting books left behind by humans, learning to read and speak their language. He even gave himself a human-like name, Braun, and tried to connect with his people by teaching them new things. He introduced them to fire, built houses, and showed them ways to communicate without words. But over time, his people began to treat him like some kind of deity. No one dared approach him, not even his family. He found himself alone, looking down from afar. One day, a storm hit their forest. Braun was away from the pack, and when he came back, he found his entire village had been wiped out by a landslide. There were no survivors. Strangely, he wasn't sad. Instead, he realized how truly alone he was. Years later, while Braun was camping and reading a book, a human attacked him. But when the human saw him reading, he was shocked. The man had recently heard of an orc who had taken down a wyvern, and he thought Braun might be the one. The man realized Braun wasn't like the other orcs, so he apologized for the attack. After hearing Braun's story, the man understood that Braun wanted a real fight, someone who could challenge him, not just trade blows like orcs usually did. The man encouraged Braun to chase that dream. He mentioned having fought alongside a legendary hero named Yamato, one of the famous 5. Braun was skeptical. Yamato's legend was over 200 years old. But the man revealed he had written the book about it and was none other than Bruston, the man who had fought beside Yamato. Bruston shared his own dream of defeating Kaiser El Sapit, a mighty opponent, and suggested that Braun might get closer to his own dream by helping him with his. Braun agreed, and the two of them formed a group called the Orichalcum Fist. Strong people from all over joined, but none were able to give Braun the kind of fight he sought. So, Braun came up with a brutal training plan. Mate was skeptical, saying no one could survive such tough training, but then Braun met Rick. Braun admitted he had talked too much and that it was time to get back to their fight. Rick remembered how Braun had supervised his training over the last 2 years and was grateful for it. He wondered if the best way to repay Braun was by landing a few easy hits using his thread slicer and avoiding melee combat with his airshot. He wasn't sure it would be enough, but he gave Braun a thumbs up. Braun, surprised, returned the gesture. The two exchanged fist bumps and began battling with everything they had. As they fought, the intensity of their blows caused shockwaves that cracked the arena's barrier. Mate, worried about the damage, used a spell called Spirited Away to evacuate the audience. Outside the arena, everyone was shocked to see the destruction, while Rick and Braun kept on fighting. Rick noticed that while Braun's blows were stronger, he was managing to land more hits than Braun. The arena was in ruins by now, and Braun knocked Rick down with a powerful uppercut. But Rick wasn't giving up. He got back up, remembering everything Braun had taught him. Both fighters were exhausted, but neither was willing to stop. The fight reached a turning point when Rick activated his hidden skill, Reckless Soul **. Braun was surprised, and Mate and Alisar were pleased that their secret training had worked. They had been teaching Rick how to control his skill, and now the real fight began. With renewed energy, Rick and Braun traded even harder blows, both realizing they were no longer alone in their battles. As the fight reached its climax, both were tired and bloodied. They unleashed one final punch that sent a shockwave through the arena. When the dust settled, Rick and Braun were both still standing. Rick admitted Braun was incredibly strong, but Braun said Rick had helped him achieve his dream. In the end, Braun declared Rick the winner. Later, Rick woke up in the hospital, surprised to find out he had been unconscious for 3 days. Rionette was there, and they joked about a promised hot springs trip. But when Rick found out that Braun had technically won the fight, he reluctantly accepted it. Braun, ever humble, said Rick was the real winner for helping him get closer to his dream. Braun shared that their journey wasn't over. They still had to find the second orb, which would bring them closer to their ultimate goal. Rionette had prepared a spare gem for the orb, and Alisar used her magic to fill it with energy. The group kept moving forward. Rick then asked about Reinhardt's true age. Braun explained that Reinhardt had an inherent skill that let him live for centuries, though no one knew his exact age. Rick wondered if Reinhardt was on some kind of secret mission, but Braun joked that he was just on the run after forgetting to return some books. As they left the town, Rick reflected on how much he had grown. He'd always dreamed of being an adventurer, and he was living that dream now, even if it was a little late. He thought that dreams don't have an expiration date, even in your 30s.